Greetings, students. Mr. Little here, and today we're going to have a look at building and resisting empire. This has to go with your textbook, chapter 32, part 2, and in this particular presentation, we're going to take a look at how empires were built, but also how empires were resisted and some of the effects of these empires. So by the end of this presentation, you should be able to answer the two following essential questions and probably much more. But how did various peoples around the world utilize cultural and political organizations and mechanisms to openly resist imperial expansion between 1800 and 1900? And how did economic interest influence the structure and course of imperial expansion in Africa, Asia, and Latin America in the time period between So with the question of how empires actually grew from 1800 to 1900, there were a couple of ways that territory was actually acquired by imperial governments. One of these ways was the shift from companies to empires. You might remember the East India companies. Well, by the 1850s, they were all bankrupt or out of business. So this was one way imperial governments took over company territory. There was also the transfer of personal property to imperial governments. This really only applies to Leopold II and his personal control over the Congo. There was a great scandal that we'll talk about in a minute, and the Belgian government had to confiscate the Congo territory from him. So the growth of empire can be described as partially a shift from privately owned empire to government or nation state owned empire. And then there were just a lot of wars, a lot of conflict, the old fashioned way that you get territory, just going out and conquering it. And of course, the thing to note about this is it was never about imperialism. No one ever went out because they needed to get some imperial territory. There was always a reason, right? We need to suppress piracy. Our allies in a local conflict are being defeated. We're going to suppress the slave trade, right? Or free trade. We want free trade, right? But no slave trade. So almost always wars of conquest in the history books are never described as imperial wars. They're always described as a war over something else. Of course, every now and then you do just have a straight out imperial conflict. So for example, the city of Tsingtao in China was seized by the German Empire without too much provocation, although there was the murder of a German missionary, but nonetheless, outright annexation and outright just taking things was often not the case. There was usually some reason behind the scenes for needing to take this thing. And sometimes it was rivalry between two imperial powers. So for example, Portugal and Great Britain negotiated how they would divide up parts of southern Africa, and Russia and Japan went to war with each other over influence in Korea and northern China. It's worth noting that the growth of these empires, the violence was not usually directed between European empires. The violence was almost always directed at indigenous peoples, Africans, Asians. So the growth of empire, while it sometimes is depicted as a peaceful occurrence for Europeans, was definitely not so for the people being colonized. So that's how empires grew their territory, but what about the different types of empire? Well, there's three different types of control that we often describe when we talk about the European empires in the age of imperialism. One is called the informal empire, and the informal empire refers to places that are under imperial influence, European or American influence, but they're not directly controlled. So for example, the Qing dynasty in China, or for the United States, Latin America. These are informal empires where the imperial powers have control over economic life, foreign trade, but they don't actually claim to control the territory that they influence. So for example, the open door policy in China was a great way to keep China independent, but still control its foreign trade. When we talk more about the Cold War, the 20th century and the early 21st century, this question of an informal empire can come to apply to many different states, including the US. There's two other types of empire. There's direct military and political rule, and incorporation of this territory into the home country. This didn't actually happen very often. So for example, in Algeria, where the French settled many millions of citizens, Algeria actually became a part of France. It had representation in the French government, and it was an integral part of France. The same with Puerto Rico in the United States, as well as Goa in the Portuguese colonies. This was not always the case. This was actually much rarer the case. And this usually happened because of strategic resources or some other sort of strategic geography. So Algeria was on the coast of the Mediterranean, very close to France. And that's part of the reason why it was considered so important. Also, in the case of the United States and Puerto Rico and the Philippines, there was this idea of the civilizing mission taking precedent and therefore requiring direct control over such a territory. Much more common would be what we would call indirect rule, or the concept of a protectorate. And that is where an imperial power offers to protect and secure the independence of a place. in exchange for control over their foreign policy. And this usually means that local elites, local kings, local rulers, supported by weapons and money from Europe, and sometimes having their children educated in Europe, administer this territory and control its economic life on behalf of Europe. And so, for example, British Nigeria was a great example of this, where the British only actually controlled mostly the coast of Nigeria, but had deals and agreements with the rulers in further inland in Nigeria. Same thing with Russian Central Asia. Russia had agreements with the existing rulers of Central Asia to be part of the Russian Empire, but didn't necessarily have much of the way of a presence there, apart from some settlers. Now, of course, one of the things to note is that some of these local elites or their immediate descendants are going to become the sources of resistance and the sources of sovereignty aspirations. So, for example, the Indian National Congress, which we're going to talk about a bit more in a second, became a source of independence aspiration, even though most of them had at some point served in the Indian civil service of the British Empire. And sometimes these local elites, just being elites, did not save them from being detested by locals. Locals could often tell who was really pulling the strings behind the scenes. So, for example, the Women's War, which happened in 1922, was a tax protest against the local elites who were doing the bidding of the British in West Africa. All of this is to say, if indirect rule was the primary mode of imperial governance, how secure were European empires? And how long did they actually last? Right? We think of an empire, we think of it as long and powerful. You know, if indirect rule and an informal empire was the norm, how strong was that? Does that make the concept of empire weak, or does it actually make it very strong? It's something worth thinking about. All right, let's start off by talking about empire building and empire resistance in Africa, as you can see here circled on the map. So before the arrival of Europeans in the interior of Africa, it's worth remembering that Europeans did have a presence along the coast of Africa, these old trading post empires, but they were too small in number. They were technologically not any better than the African empires that dominated the inland or the small kingdoms on the coast, and Europeans were susceptible to diseases like malaria. This can be seen in the fact that the early attempts by the British to incur deeper into the coast of West Africa in the 1830s met with total defeat in the First Anglo-Ashanti War, the first of several. But this meant that for many centuries, Europeans were confined to the coast for a good reason. Now, before Europe arrived, there were a number of states all across West Africa. You can see some of them on this map, but some of the larger ones might be the Zulu Kingdom in southern Africa, Ethiopia, which we've talked about in chapter 31, the Wassoulou Empire, which was in West Africa, what is now Mali, the Sokohot Caliphate in what is now Nigeria and parts of the Sahel, as well as a number of other smaller Islamic governments across West Africa. So prior to the arrival of Europeans, Africa was not empty. Africa had a number of developing or developed states. Now, part of the reason why this paradigm shifts is because of the invention of new technologies. As I talked about last time, steamships allowed for the exploration of the great African rivers like the Congo, the Zambezi, and the Niger rivers, as well as the introduction of quinine, which is a malaria medicine, made it possible for Europeans to travel into Africa and not potentially die of malaria, which is awesome. There were a number of explorers, which is sometimes one of the additional themes of the origins of imperialism people bring up. So Dr. David Livingstone crosses Africa between in the early 1880s. He goes from Western Africa to Eastern Africa, right through the center, which had not been done by any European at that point. And this really makes it possible, gives people the idea that Africa isn't, in fact, an impenetrable dark continent. We can cross it and explore it. And it's a rivalry between Belgium and Portugal over who actually has control of the Congo territory. You might remember that the Congo Kingdom was a Portuguese-influenced state. And so this clashed with King Leopold's claim to control the Congo territory, which is in Central Africa. This led to something called the Berlin Conference in 1884, in which all the European powers came together and established the rules for claiming a new colony, as well as settling disputes between each other about which colony was going to go where. It's worth noting that the Ottoman Empire attended this conference and ceded much of its territory in Africa, and no actual Africans were allowed to come to the conference. The fact that no Africans were allowed to attend the conference really speaks to the perception of the imperial powers about who they were dealing with. So in general, it's good to have a sort of summary about where the major imperial powers were. So this map right here and this quick summary I've provided is a way that if you should ever need to bring it up on an exam or mention it in an SAQ, it's worth remembering that North and West Africa, usually considered to be French, Algeria is the great example. Coastal Africa, coastal West Africa, the British, Ghana is the great example there. Nigeria is also a great example. East Africa, both Britain and Germany had a number of colonies there. Kenya, the British colony, was a great example. Central Africa, dominated by the Belgian Congo. And South Africa kind of split between the Portuguese and the British. Mozambique is a well-known Portuguese colony, and South Africa was a well-known British colony. So it's good to just know I've got a couple of examples that could potentially help you out on a short answer question or an LEQ. Let's start with the story of the Congo, the colony that started it all, if you will. So the story of the Congo Free State is really a story of typical of imperialism, but I'll go ahead and tell it. So the Congo Free State refers to a territory that roughly corresponds with today's Democratic Republic of the Congo, and that was not part of the Belgian Empire, but was the personal territory of King Leopold II of Belgium. So what he did was he was interested in Dr. Livingstone's journey across Africa. He paid explorers to go into Central Africa, into the Congo Basin, and to pay various chiefs and make agreements with various chiefs to have them acknowledge King Leopold II as their king. Although it's worth noting a lot of the chiefs didn't really understand what it was they were agreeing to or understand the papers they were signing. This, nonetheless, in the eyes of the European powers, gave Leopold II claim to the Congo territory. Now, King Leopold II dressed up his intentions with the argument that he was going to end the slave trade. And to this extent, he created a force of local soldiers called the Force Publique to control the territory and to suppress the Arab slave traders coming from East Africa. He did indeed suppress the slave trade. In many ways, he replaced it with something even worse, which was a form of coerced labor and terror, which was enforced brutally, most notably through amputations. If one did not bring enough rubber to meet the quotas for that particular week, their hand could be amputated or they could be killed. It's estimated that through this use of terror to enforce economic extraction quotas, perhaps 5 to 10 million people died, and life in the Congo was horribly disrupted by the new work regimentation and violence that could break out at any time. A feature that would be common in many other imperial territories was that international companies were given regional concessions. As you can see on the map on the right, Leopold II allowed certain companies to operate in certain territories of the Congo. And so this brought the Congo worldwide attention, in part because of the work of a number of missionaries who noticed that the brutality being inflicted upon the Congolese people was not in keeping with the civilizing mission rhetoric that Leopold II was espousing about why he went to the Congo to end the slave trade and educate the masses. And yet it seemed as though the violence was not leading to this. And an Irish civil servant named Roger Casement and noticed something working in a merchant office. He noticed that what was going into the Congo was bullets, ammunition, and other weapons, but what was coming out of the Congo was rubber and wealth for Leopold II. And he published a report in 1903, essentially documenting all of the horrors that had been inflicted upon the people of the Congo by the Belgians. And this scandal eventually forced Leopold II to give up the Congo Free State and transfer it to Belgium. And while that may sound like a happy ending, it's worth noting the Belgian government literally did no better. That's true, they got rid of the Force Publique or reined in its worst excesses, but they did not build any government schools, they didn't build any hospitals or provide any services to the indigenous peoples. When the Congo gained its independence in the 1960s, there were less than 10 Congolese that had any sort of higher education beyond primary school. And in many ways, the Congo story is going to be typical of imperialism around the world, including the excessive use of violence to control populations. The infrastructure that is created is not for the service of the indigenous, it's for extracting resources. It's for extracting rubber or tin or copper or opium, whatever you have it. The support of business and financial interests to expand imperial expansion, the chasing of resources, the ecological devastation, in this case, wide-scale deforestation and the destruction of rubber trees, along with the massive loss of life and disruption of existing life patterns. There is a debate over whether the murder of 5 to 10 million Congolese ought to be characterized as a genocide. There is an argument to be made that the use of force and terror to extract resources counts as an intentional destruction of a people. When we discuss the Berlin Conference, we talk about how the European powers carved up Africa, kind of like a piece of cake or maybe a pizza. And that's an accurate analogy. right? And we point out that there were no Africans invited to the Berlin Conference. That's also accurate. But I think it really disguises the fact that drawing borders had real social, political, economic, and cultural consequences. The drawing of borders, the imposition of borders over geographic areas where they may have had no natural existence, or the dividing up of ethnic groups that had been united for thousands of years, severed networks of exchange and communication. Sometimes putting multiple ethnic groups in a single state fosters rivalries because imperial administrators play favoritism, and this leads to lasting cultural enmity between groups. Economic systems built within these borders has limited economic development since independence. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the 20th century. And violence from the conflicts that are trying to change these borders, or the instability inherent in some of these borders, has led to thousands, if not millions, of deaths since the age of imperialism. The map on the right here is from a study that examines the long-run effects of drawing these borders. Everywhere you see in orange is an ethnic group that's been divided up across a border. A quote from the study is, "We further show that civil conflict is not only concentrated in historic homelands of partitioned ethnic groups, but groups adjacent to split ethnicities are also more likely to experience longer and more devastating, in terms of casualties, conflicts." In other words, places where ethnic groups were divided have a much higher probability of engaging in long, destructive conflicts. To simply leave the story at the Berlin Conference would be inaccurate. What was decided at that conference has had long-lasting implications. But now that we've talked a little bit about empire building in Africa, let's talk about resistance. Notice all the black circles here. Everywhere there's a black circle indicates a major center of resistance at some point across Africa. Let us start with political resistance. That is, existing states in Africa forcibly resisting European encroachment using industrial weaponry, local geography, and local support. So let's start with North Africa, the Ahmed Orabi revolt in Egypt. So you might remember from chapter 31 that Egypt was increasingly being incorporated into the British informal empire. So this chafed the educated officers who saw their ruler, their Khedive, their monarch, as simply a British puppet, and decided to throw them out. So this move by the military officers is going to have a legacy down the line that we'll talk about in the 20th century, but it also had support from everybody, the peasants, the religious leaders, the merchant elite. Everybody was in favor of ousting this British puppet, except for, of course, the British, who then promptly bombarded Alexandria, destroying the city effectively, invaded and reinstalled the ruler. This was in part done to secure the Suez Canal, and Egypt would be occupied until 1921. But Egypt would also be one of the first places in Africa to gain its full independence. In West Africa, you have two very well-known examples of states resisting imperialism. So as I mentioned earlier, the Ashanti, which was a kingdom located in what is now Ghana and close to the coast of West Africa, had waged a number of small conflicts with the British, who were making an effort to control the trade on the West African coast, and the Ashanti were not conforming to the British desires to be incorporated into their trade system. A combination of geography as well as Ashanti determinism prevented the British from really getting into and annexing the Ashanti kingdom, as well as the resistance being led by the Queen Mothers, which was an institution somewhat unique to the Ashanti kingdom, where Queen Mothers could lead the army and play a large role in politics. One particularly famous Queen Mother, known as Ya Asantewa, rallied the population to resist the British and protect the Ashanti king during the War of the Golden Stool. In addition to the fact that the War of the Golden Stool was also about protecting the sacred Golden Stool, which was literally the throne on which the Ashanti king sat, which a British administrator had insisted that they be allowed to sit in. So it may seem a little petty, but this had great symbolic significance for the Ashanti people to protect this symbol from the British. Although they were finally defeated in the Fourth Anglo-Ashanti War, A, the fact that there were so many Anglo-Ashanti wars, and B, the fact that it took almost 100 years to fully incorporate the Ashanti into the British Gold Coast colony, is a reflection of the determined level of resistance. Perhaps this determined level of resistance is reflected slightly further north with Samori Touré and the Mandinka, that's the people who are from the Mali Empire, you might remember, who sought to create a Mandinka empire with Islam as a unifying force. This is a common theme throughout history on the West African plains. And while he was constantly under pressure from both the British in the south and the French in the north, he managed to maneuver and outwit the British and the French for almost 20 years until finally he was forced to conclude a truce and give up his authority to the French. In particular, in West Africa, political resistance, whether it was in the Sahara and the Sahel or on the coast, was assisted by geography. Thick forests or unwelcoming deserts made it much less likely that Europeans would want to venture out and attempt to incorporate large chunks of territory. Combine this with the determined resistance of the locals, and it's not hard to see why it literally took until the turn of the 20th century to finally incorporate much of West Africa into these European empires. Shifting a little bit further south to the Cape region, we see the creation of an empire under a man named Shaka Zulu called the Zulu Empire. Now, some people have heard of Shaka Zulu. He's famous for his new military tactics, which allowed him to defeat and incorporate most of the rival tribes in his area. The Zulu conquests and raids were so prolific that they led to a movement known as the Lefakane, or the upheaval, that is the fleeing of the tribes, by which a number of tribes around the Zulu fled to escape their encroaching empire. And the Zulu themselves would clash with the European settlers coming north from the Cape until the 1870s, when a terrible drought caused the empire to disintegrate. Some of those settlers coming north from the Cape were themselves seeking freedom from what they perceived to be oppression. These were a group known as the Boers, and they were the descendants of Dutch settlers from hundreds of years ago. And they sought freedom from the British, and so they moved northward and founded several republics known as the Transvaal Republics. And these republics sometimes clashed with the Zulu Empire over questions of land use and disputes over cattle ownership. But in the late 1880s, the discovery of diamonds, the famous Kimberley diamond mine in South Africa, spurred the British control, not wanting this mine to potentially come under the influence of the Germans in East Africa to their north. They launched several campaigns to incorporate the Boer republics into the British colony of South Africa. And this war illustrates a number of the common tactics used in these conflicts. So, for example, the Boers attacked railways to limit British movement, trains being an essential part of the British Empire in this region. But the British utilized concentration camps and rounded up Boer families in order to force the fighters to surrender, a tactic we would see repeated throughout the 20th century with horrifying results. In addition to political resistance, there are movements we would consider religiously motivated. And two that I'd like to talk about in Northern Africa utilized Islam as their source of resistance. The first one would be the Mahdist state, which existed in Sudan from 1881 to 1898. And it was a young Sudanese preacher named Muhammad Ahmad who claimed to be the Mahdi. Now, the Mahdi is a figure in Islam that is sort of a savior figure that's going to bring about the end of the world in a good way, not a bad way. And he claimed to be the Mahdi, and so he claimed to be fighting against the British and the Egyptians, not just in a standard political resistance, but actually in religious terms, in the name of Islam. And many of the Mahdi's armies, banners, and symbols and words reflected this belief that they were fighting in the name of Islam. And the Mahdists had a number of small victories. For example, the siege of Khartoum, which is the current capital of Sudan, the Mahdists besieged and destroyed a British and Egyptian force. Even those who may not have believed that Muhammad Ahmed was the Mahdi did join the movement, in part because the Sudan had been under the influence of Egypt, who had been exploiting them. Sudanese slaves and forced laborers had helped to build the Suez Canal. So Egypt had been treating Sudan like a colony, and in some ways the Mahdist challenge was simply a revolt against this domination. Now, the Mahdists were eventually defeated in 1898 at the Battle of Omdurman, which was a horrendous defeat, but where an army of 100,000 Mahdists was defeated by machine guns and artillery. Nonetheless, the Mahdist challenge is an essential part of the Sudanese identity to this day. Then there's the movement by Amir Abdul Qadir, who is a Sufi leader among Bedouin nomads. Those are people who lived out in the Sahara Desert in North Africa, who was elected at a very young age by his community to lead the resistance against the French, whom he trounced in 1835, and consolidated a small Islamic state in what is now Algeria. One thing to note about Abdul Qadir's Islamic State, though, is that we normally in the 21st century hear the word Islamic State, and we might get a little bit nervous, or we picture something intolerant or terrible. But Abdul Qadir's Islamic State actually utilized Christians and Jews in his administration and did not actively discriminate against them. He also never claimed to be the leader of the Islamic world. He never took the title of Sultan or Caliph. He simply was content to focus on his own spiritual development while leading the state at the same time. Now, the state did not last very long. 2 years after its formation, the French again invaded, using more brutal tactics to force the surrender of the Bedouins. Abdul Qadir himself surrendered and was exiled to Lebanon, where he actually became even more famous for saving a bunch of Christians during interfaith riots in Beirut in the 1860s. So Islam as a religious tradition was a source of incredible inspiration to resist imperial powers, both simply as a reason for common individuals to fight, but also as an ideology to center a state around. In the southern part of Africa, we see several millenarian types of resistance movements. One of the most famous was the Xhosa cattle movement of the 1850s, and this was spread and propagated by a young prophet named Nangawuse. And I'm not actually saying that right. There's actually meant to be sort of a click in between the G and the Q. So non-click Awuse. There's supposed to be a click, imagine that it's there, who envisioned the end of British rule in southern Africa. So she was a member of the Xhosa tribe. And the Xhosa actually had a long tradition of female prophets communicating with ancestors. So her having a vision was not actually that unusual. It would not have been seen as crazy. And the Xhosa cattle herds were plagued with a lung disease, which was possibly introduced by the British. So the Xhosa people were on hard times. Their traditional way of life was under threat by a combination of ecological change and political change. That is the encroachment of British people from the Cape Colony. Nangawuse said that the Xhosa people would have to slaughter all of their cattle and burn their farms for the prophecy to come true. And while this is sometimes viewed from the lens of the 21st century as an incredibly suicidal act, the passion and the letter to which it was followed, in which probably 400,000 or more cattle were in fact slaughtered, demonstrates a genuine belief and a genuine desire to change the status quo, a genuine act of resistance in the pursuit of a millenarian vision. This is somewhat similar to the ghost dance movement in the United States, where Native Americans in an act of resistance sought to remove the influence of the white man via a dance movement. A little bit further north in the German colony of East Africa, what is now Tanzania, there was a revolt known as the Maji Revolt. This was preceded by several additional revolts, and so there was a simmering sense of rebellion among the peoples of German East Africa. A spiritual medium known simply as Bokoro claimed to have an invincibility elixir, which he distributed to his followers, claiming it would protect them from German bullets. It did not, but nonetheless, this was a huge uprising that lasted for several years and took thousands of German soldiers to put down. And it was followed by not just local religious leaders, not just indigenous religious leaders, but also by Muslims living in the area, also joined in the revolt as a demonstration of wanting to effectively remove the Germans from their region. This is somewhat similar to the Boxer Rebellion that we talked about in chapter 31 in China. The idea of a magic elixir that can make one invincible to bullets was something we also saw in the Boxer Rebellion. Let us talk now about South and Central Asia. That is what's now India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Iran, and the other stands of Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, etc., etc. The main place to talk about here would be what we now consider India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, also known as British South Asia. So we start off this unit with the British East India Company asserting its control over South Asia. Now, the British East India Company administrators see themselves as replacing the Mughals. They are taking the place of the Mughal Empire, but they're not imposing British rule. However, over the course of the 19th century, as the East India Company became more and more financially dependent on the British government because they were not very good at trading, they increasingly had to do what the British government wanted them to do, which was to do things like introduce Christian missionaries, introduce British education into what is now India. Combine this with several political moves, something called the Doctrine of Lapse, by which any Indian kingdom that did not have a male heir would immediately be absorbed by the East India Company, increasingly high taxes, as well as something known as the 100-Year Prophecy, which predicted that British rule and influence in India would end after 100 years, and you had a situation that was ripe for explosion. And it came through the work of one man named Mangal Pandey, who was a Sepoy, that is an Indian soldier volunteering in the British East India Company Army, who refused to use his issued rifle because it was believed that the cartridge of the rifle, that is where you got the bullet and the powder from, was laced with pork or cow fat, and this would have been sacrilegious to both Hindus and Muslims. Now, it's not actually known for sure, even to this day, if it was in fact laced with cow or pork fat, but the fact that they believed, and by they I mean the Sepoys, believed that it was enough of a reason to believe that they were all about to be Christianized and that now was the time to revolt. And this led to the 1857 rebellion, also known as the Sepoy Revolt, sometimes called in India the First War for Independence. But it's really interesting because what the Sepoy Revolt sort of turned into was almost like a Mughal restoration. Like they attempted to put the last Mughal emperor back on the throne. And so some extreme nationalists in India today don't look at the Sepoy Revolt as actually a good thing. They see it as an attempt by a Muslim power to reassert its control over northern India. So it's kind of one of those questions about, perspective and narrative and history. It's worth noting the 1857 was not the first or the final revolt against British rule in India. So it's the one that gets a lot of attention because it was the one that led to the transition from company rule to British rule, that is the Raj or direct rule over India, along with the accommodation of zamindars and rajas from various princely states. And so this established a formal British administration in India with perhaps 100,000 British administrators and a couple million indigenous administrators to go with them. And to do this, the British set up something called a civil service exam, by which they recruited the children of the elites to help administer the empire. To do this, they established a number of universities. This civil service exam, these universities, and the opportunities of some high-class, high-caste Indians to travel abroad and get education all sort of resulted in the creation of something called the Indian National Congress, which was a movement whose ultimate goal was first self-rule and then full-on independence for British India. And it was mostly made up of former civil servants, which raises an interesting question. Does imperialism sow the seeds of its own destruction? And it's worth noting the Indian National Congress also points out that some groups always benefited from imperialism. The British Raj incorporated what is now South Asia into the British economic empire, and the Indian subcontinent becomes the place where export crops are grown: tea, cotton, tobacco, opium, wheat. All of these crops are grown in British South Asia and shipped either to Britain, sometimes over to China. But basically, India is the jewel in the British crown for a very good reason. And the construction of railways allows this to be sped up even more. By 1880, there's over 9,000 miles of railway in British India. And this allows for a rapid exploitation of resources. And one of the negative side effects of so many railway lines is the impact the railways had on the famine. So between 1857 and 1900, there were 7 major famines across South Asia. Now, South Asia, you might remember, way back in Unit 1, is affected by the monsoon winds. And the monsoon winds do occasionally, every 10 years, 12 years or so, don't come regularly, right? And that can cause a famine, potentially, if it's not handled correctly. And so historians and scholars have sort of put the onerous of these famines on the British Empire. Not to say that there would not have been a crop failure, but that British imperial policy in India and the use of railroads to gather up resources and exploit them and export them made these famines much worse than they had to be. There's even a statistic that shows that places linked by railroads had higher deaths when famine hit their area than places that were isolated and not attached to railroads, because those railroads were attached to the coast and the export of those raw materials to the coast. Just north of what is now British India, there was a stretch of territory that the British and the Russians were competing over. We now call this place Afghanistan. Now, the British attempted to incorporate Afghanistan into their empire in 1842. This resulted in the total destruction of their army, and this destruction of this army and the murder of many of the Sepoys who were fighting with the British might have in fact been one of the motivations for the Sepoy Revolt in 1857. The geography of Afghanistan made it really difficult to incorporate it into either the British Empire or the Russian Empire. And this resulted in several low-key engagements between the British forces in what is now Pakistan and the independent kingdom of Afghanistan, until 1893, when the Afghan king and the British agreed to create a border that we call the Durand Line, which, just like in Africa, both divided existing cultural groups, in particular the Baluch and the Pashtuns, and united different cultural groups that may not necessarily have wanted to be together, such as the Tajiks and the Uzbeks, into this country that we now call Afghanistan. Let us shift our attention further to the east. Let us talk about Japan, as we have talked a little bit about Japan in Chapter 31, and then let us talk about the Pacific Islands. Across the wide expanse of the Pacific, although it looks empty on a map, is actually a cluster of many islands, including places such as Tahiti, Hawaii, Fiji. And throughout the course of the Industrial Revolution and the Age of Imperialism, many of the imperial powers sought to create coaling stations for their navies, as well as plantations where they could grow tropical goods for export back to their main home. One of the most interesting episodes of this whole imperialism story in the Pacific is the Fiji measles outbreak. Now, Fiji was an island that had never been exposed to the measles disease, right? This is a great dying. This is the Native Americans all over again, right? We would expect to see an exact replica, as we saw in North America, where natives died in mass numbers because they'd never been exposed to disease. But as it turns out, the Fiji measles outbreak was comparatively mild. It only killed about 30% of the population. And so this is one of the things I talk about when we discuss why the Great Dying and disease may not have actually been such a big part of the European conquest of the Americas. I like to point to the Fiji measles outbreak and say, hey, look, it didn't completely wipe out all the people in Fiji, so maybe we should reevaluate how much a role we give disease in the conquest of the Americas. But I digress. Let's talk a little bit more about settlements. So Australia and New Zealand were both settled during this time. Australia, which is the really big continent, began as a prison colony. And eventually, after Britain kind of got tired of exporting prisoners there, non-prisoner settlers and former prisoners set up a number of mining and farming operations in Australia, which then exported those goods back to Great Britain. Now, Australia's conflict with its indigenous people, which we collectively call the Aborigines, was relatively mild. There were some battles, but in general, there wasn't anything like the kind of war that was seen in New Zealand, where the Maori, the people who had settled New Zealand, waged a vicious conflict of resistance against their settlers for almost 30 plus years, which included in one great episode in 1809, where a group of Maori snuck onto a British ship and then blew it up on accident, but nonetheless blew it up by igniting the gunpowder on the ship. And although many settlers peacefully purchased land from Maori chiefdoms, this purchasing of land and the encroachment of Europeans onto further land angered a number of other Maori chiefs who united in what's called the King movement, where they elected a king of the Maori people. Now, what's really interesting about the King movement is that the King movement was not necessarily something that was just invented. A number of Maori thinkers reached back into their history and said, no, we did actually have a king at one point, sometime in the way distant past. It was actually a form of indigenous nationalism brought up to resist encroaching European settlement in New Zealand. And that's really what it was. A settler colony is a colony in which the external settlers displace or completely eliminate the indigenous population. An additional element of this resistance was something called the Hau, which is a syncretic militant religious movement. So it was a little bit of Maori indigenous beliefs combined with some Christianity, but it was a militant religious movement that was followed by a number of followers who also were part of the King movement. And so this nationalism and militant religious syncretism were characteristic of the long conflict running between the Maori and the New Zealand settlers that really lasted until the turn of the 20th century. Now, the United States began to dip its toes into the Pacific in the 1850s, specifically with the Guano Islands Act. Now, you might remember guano as that fertilizer that everybody was after from South America. But there were some islands in the Pacific that also had guano, and the United States passed a law in 1856 that basically said, if you find an island with guano, you can harvest it and you can claim it as territory for the United States. Eventually, some of those explorers came across the island of Hawaii, where there was an existing kingdom, and a number of planters from the USA set up pineapple and sugar plantations in Hawaii. And over time, they began to exert an increasing amount of authority over the government of Hawaii, pressuring the then king of Hawaii to accept a constitution that gave the planters a great deal of power. That king's descendant, Lili'uokalani, and I hope I'm saying that correctly, began her reign by attempting to revise this constitution to limit or remove the influence of the planters. However, her attempt to change the constitution gave the planters the excuse they needed to attempt to overthrow the government, which was successful. And although the United States government officially did not have any involvement in this coup against the Kingdom of Hawaii, U.S. Marines quickly came to the island ostensibly to enforce the rule of law. Nonetheless, Hawaii would be an independent republic for 5 more years, was nonetheless in the sphere of the United States. This practice of U.S. companies or individuals from the United States with economic interest in a particular area affecting the government and the politics of that area is called economic imperialism, and we'll talk more about it in a later presentation. And then there's the Spanish-American War, which actually begins in the Caribbean, but has probably its most vicious theater in the Philippines, where Emilio Aguinaldo, a leader of a Filipino nationalist movement, had been resisting the Spanish. And when the Americans came in and drove out the Spanish, He then continued to resist the Americans because he did not want to be under any other imperial power. Nonetheless, the United States waged a vicious war for almost 5 years to suppress the Filipino insurgents, including acts of torture that they would later accuse Japan of committing upon U.S. soldiers during World War II in the Philippines. Funny how history works that way. But the United States was not about to give up its imperial possession of the Philippines, in part because it was believed the Philippines were the stepping stone for accessing the Chinese market, which had also been the reason the Spanish settled the Philippines too. Again, it's funny how history repeats itself that way. Let's talk about Japan, the rising sun. So if you'll recall earlier, we talked about Japanese reforms during the Meiji era that gave it a modern industrial base and laid the foundation for a modern military. Now, Japanese expansion across Asia was not actually anything new, if you remember from chapter 26, the invasion of Korea in 1590. But what happened this time was that Japan was very concerned about the impact of the Opium Wars. They'd seen how China had been humiliated and defeated by European powers, and therefore they were determined not to suffer the same fate. To this extent, the Japanese sought to build an empire, and they did so, first by annexing local places that had already been under their influence, like the Ryukyu Islands, which are still part of Japan to this day, as well as exerting influence in Korea via an unequal treaty. Europeans were not the only ones going around imposing those. Then there was the Sino-Japanese War, which, as I mentioned, was sparked off by a peasant revolt in Korea. But the defeat of China in the Sino-Japanese War led to the end of Chinese influence in Korea and the effective transformation of Korea into a Japanese puppet, later to be directly annexed as a colony. Now, Japan's rapid expansion into Korea and its influence in northern China got Russia a little bit nervous, and so Russia attempted to drive Japan out of Korea and out of northern China in the Russo-Japanese War, which didn't work and resulted in a total Japanese victory at the Battle of Tsushima, where they completely annihilated the Russian fleet. And so Japanese imperial expansion was predicated upon its modern military-industrial base. And the fact that Japan had been so successful at creating this modern empire made it seen by other Asian nationalist leaders as a place that could effectively help them take control of their own destinies. In addition to many Asian nationalists, the Ottoman Empire recognized the power of Japan and sent a number of diplomatic missions in the 1890s. However, this question of Japan being the leader of a pan-Asian movement, that is, a movement to expel European powers from Asia, contrasted with the idea of Japan simply building an empire for itself. So, for example, Korea was an independent kingdom that Japan effectively annexed, even though Korean diplomats traveled to the United States in 1910 to appeal for help and ask for assistance against Japan. Korean delegates would also travel to the post-World War I peace treaty conference in Versailles, also to ask for help, also to be ignored. And in many ways, Japanese behavior in Korea was very similar to other European powers' behavior in their colonies. Japan imposed Shintoism and made Japanese the official language. Japan's industrialization and growth of a modern military does make one wonder if industrialization automatically leads to imperialism, or if imperialism is necessary for industrialization. It is a good question. It's worth noting that Japan's military expansion, though, raises the question of profitability. So the thing about the Japanese empire is that, unlike European empires, it was almost never profitable in any way, although it was a source of additional food when it was necessary, and rice imports from, say, Taiwan are a great example of a ghost acres concept in action. That is, having extra land to support a larger population on a set of islands that wouldn't be able to normally support it, like Great Britain. But Japan's empire was more about military security. It sought to establish a perimeter around the home islands that would protect it from any potential invasion. It wasn't so much about profitability. In fact, if anything, Korea and Taiwan required more money from Japan every year, at least from the government. That didn't mean that individual business people didn't make a profit. And Japan wasn't exactly looking, at least not initially, for raw materials. Until the 1930s, Japan got everything it needed from the United States and Great Britain. Therefore, it did not need to go out and expand and take over lots of new territory. Another kind of question about the profitability of empire comes from the British de-industrialization of South Asia. As is mentioned before, South Asia being incorporated into the British Empire, into the British trading system, resulted in the destruction, intentional and unintentional, of many of its existing industries. The textile industry, ruined by taxes; the mining industry, outlawed by colonial policy that was afraid of weapons forging. The demand for raw materials to fuel Britain's industrialization spurred the shift from production on an industrial level or semi-industrial level to the creation of raw materials like cotton, indigo, or opium. Although British India did see minor industrial movements, that is, movements towards what we would consider an industrial economy. For example, the creation of the Tata Iron and Steel Company, which is still one of the largest steel companies in India to this day, and had the largest steel plant in the entire British Empire located in India. These industrial movements within this colony were for military production, that is, the production of weapons to defend the colony itself, or to produce cheaper iron for the United Kingdom home market, as the increasing cost of labor in the United Kingdom made iron production there less cheap. And this is a point that most imperial territories were not immediately profitable. We talked about the demand for resources and raw materials, but these territories were not immediately profitable. The cost of troops, infrastructure, transportation. Apologists for imperialism often point to these immediate costs, saying that there was no direct tangible benefit. But this is not true. One must take a bigger look at the bigger picture. You might remember the core periphery model I've talked about all throughout this unit, right? An industrialized core and a periphery that provides them raw materials. This also implies a hierarchical relationship. That is, the industrialized core dominates the terms of the exchange. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this later, but the creation of a monetized world economy would give the central imperial powers immense control even after the Age of Empire has ended. And tax and labor laws in imperial territories resulted in long-term profits. The easy movement of labor across the empire, among other things, meant that even if territories were not immediately profitable, in the long run, they made the imperial centers much more wealthy than they would have been without access to those markets, goods, and this vast pool of labor. We're going to talk more about this as we go throughout this unit, but just something to keep in mind. So within these empires, a sort of colonial society sprung up, and the imposition of Western values in many of these places were especially prominent in the settler societies, which either replaced or marginalized or completely exterminated the indigenous communities that lived with them. For example, New Zealand, parts of South Africa, parts of Algeria, parts of Kenya, and in the United States as it relates to the Native Americans. These societies, whether settler or not, created educational institutions, either universities for the elites or missionary schools for everybody else. And even though this was meant to make these people more like Europeans, to civilize them, right? Remember the civilizing mission, the mission to bring progress. It's interesting to note that the learning about democracy, natural rights, and popular sovereignty quickly became a source of resistance. If all men are equal, aren't we equal? Why are you dominating my country? And there was a great deal of ecological disruption that went along with this too. I should also note the arrival of rats, in particular in Pacific Islands, destroyed a number of tropical bird species. The Maori people in New Zealand, one of the things that distressed many of them was the Norwegian rat, which came in European ships, which was physically much larger than the Maori rat, drove it to the point of extinction. And the Maori people often said that so goes their rat, so goes their people. And the transition to plantation economies in Pacific Islands, as well as in Southeast Asia, led to mass deforestation in the name of creating plantations, something that we still see today in many parts of Southeast Asia or tropical regions where the demand for things such as palm oil or coffee continues to damage and devastate tropical jungles, where the demand for these goods on a larger scale than they might locally be produced led to massive deforestation. One question that often comes up when talking about the rise of imperial empires, which is, why did certain groups collaborate with imperial powers, right? Why did certain groups collaborate with the British or collaborate with the Russians or collaborate with the French? Here we must be careful. We cannot retroactively ascribe nationalities or ethnicities to people living in a certain territory. And the answer of why would you collaborate with an imperial power is the same reason as individuals collaborated with the Spanish or the Portuguese or the British or the French during the original age of colonialism. And that is oftentimes it was to gain an immediate economic or military advantage, typically over a rival. Existing rulers might appreciate the use of imperial power to reinforce their own rule. So for example, in northern Nigeria, there were a number of Islamic states ruling over non-Islamic people. So oftentimes rulers are more than happy to pledge allegiance to a far-off queen if it meant that they got to stay in power where they were. And individuals were given the opportunity to amass wealth and gain prestige, maybe more so than they would have been able to without imperialism. So the civil service, military service, or other jobs serving in the imperial hierarchy provided the opportunity for wealth, land, opportunities that some peoples, especially if they were a member of a marginalized group, a marginalized ethnic group, a marginalized caste, a marginalized cultural group, a marginalized religion, if they would not traditionally have these opportunities, they may be more than happy to work with an imperial power if it would give them those opportunities. And so again, why did some people, why did some groups collaborate with coming imperial powers? Couldn't they foresee that this was going to be the domination of their homeland? And the answer is, well, maybe they did or maybe they didn't. But either way, they did it because they saw something to gain. And so we'll sort of wrap this up by just talking about the themes of the Imperial Age. So what themes did we see throughout the growth of imperial empires? Well, one is that imperial powers struggled to establish empire. Direct rule was not the primary form of rule. Civil servants and local forces made the empire possible. Technology did not always provide the decisive factor, and geography routinely limited the expansion, whether that's in Afghanistan or against the Ashanti. Imperial rule was a struggle. It was not something where the indigenous people just rolled over and said, okay, here, you can rule us. And resistance to imperialism, speaking of which, was motivated by a variety of processes. For example, the loss of political autonomy, attempts to limit or secularize religious societies, the disruption of economic life. All of these things could potentially be a motivation to revolt against an imperial power. And it's worth remembering that among the causes of military expansion, economic and military incentive were often paramount. So for example, the desire to secure strategic assets, the desire to gain an advantage over a rival imperial power, or the desire to directly or indirectly control resources such as rubber, cacao, diamonds, what have you. It's also worth noting, and I cannot stress this enough, that the boundaries drawn by the imperial powers during the age of the imperialism, most of which are still in use today, would have lasting consequences. And it is really important not to forget that part. Most of the people in the world today are living in boundaries that were drawn by someone other than the people living in them at the time. So thank you so much for sticking with me. I sincerely hope that this presentation has answered some questions you might have, but I also hope that you walk away with even more questions. You should definitely be able to answer those first two questions from the beginning of the presentation and more. I want to thank you so much for sticking with me. My name is Mr. Little, and I'll see you next time. Hey there. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this video was able to help you. If you appreciate this kind of work, please like and subscribe. And of course, I welcome any kind of feedback or suggestions, so feel free to leave a comment down below. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm Mr. Little, and I'll see you next time.